Yeah, my theme is echoes of Christ. I think there are clear echoes of Christ throughout the entirety of Dune. A lot of that has to do with Frank Herbert, who was influenced heavily by many different religions, Islam, Buddhism, even Catholicism. And what's cool is you see Paul is thrust into the prophecy about being the one who's going to bring the people of Arrakis into the promised land. And then that's going to be causing the desert planet and to turn into a lush, green, thriving oasis with springs of water. And Paul is supposedly going to be doing this by removing the heel of the Corino Empire off of their necks and to restore the Fremen back to the way of life that they once had. And throughout the movie, Paul is struggling because he doesn't believe himself to be the Muad'Dib, but his mother and his sister from inside the womb and the entirety of the Fremen of the South, they believe he is. And so ultimately, it's not a perfect parallel because Christ did not claim that he was not the Messiah. He actually teaches the opposite. He teaches he is the Messiah. One thing I will note as an apologetic against Islam is, and that's just simply because of how influential that religion is to this movie. Jesus was not just a prophet who did the will of Allah, Jesus was God. And so,
Hmm.
one major difference between Paul and Jesus, outside of their very essence, is the fact that Paul did not believe he was the Messiah, but Jesus taught from a very early age, from the scroll of Isaiah, that he was the one whom Isaiah prophesied about. Um, then I thought of the triumphant entry. So when Paul finally does go south, he walks right into the temple, and everyone kind of just parts the way for him. And it reminded me, one, of the triumphant entry, but then also Jesus flipping tables. And so he is so unlike what they expected. Jesus is. He's just so unlike what they expected. What's interesting is what we see in Paul, which is like this warrior Messiah, is exactly what the Jews expected Jesus to
Mm,
be.
yeah.
And yet, Jesus was the exact opposite. And that's why so many people discredited Jesus from being the Messiah. Imagine if, like, the whole story of Dune, Paul was actually more like Jesus in the fact that he wasn't a warrior, but that he had to quite literally lay down his life. Like, you couldn't get away from the gospel parallel there. But it made me think of those two, the triumphal entry and the temple, because Paul is supposed to kill Stilgar in order to speak. And then he breaks that religious cultural tradition and then starts flipping it on its head. And then Paul actually makes an I am statement there. And he's fully noting who he is in the middle of all those people. And then they all start worshiping him. And then it made me think Jesus' triumphal entry, Palm Sunday, they're all crying out, Hosanna on the highest. And once Paul makes his I am statement, that's what all the crowd is doing at that point. They start worshiping him. And the last one I'll shoot off, the wedding of an enemy is very Romans 5. Of course, Paul is doing this for political gain. He tells the emperor that he will take the hand of his daughter and the crown, and he is offering to care for her and to protect her. Jesus lays down his life, uniting us to him by his blood to secure for us peace. And he is now seated at the right hand of the Father. Paul,
Mm.
marrying the princess, would then be seated because his work is completed. He would then be the emperor ruling over and finally having freed the Fremen from their bondage and captivity to their overlords, which is ultimately what Jesus does for us with sin and death. He frees us from sin and death and unites us to him by his blood. Those are echoes of Christ, man. There are so
Mm.
many more. Did you guys pick up on any that I didn't list?
If you didn't mention this, but that he had to come from another world, right?
Oh,
That he
Oh, yeah.
descended, and
Hmm.
so he wasn't. You know, and even in this movie, they make it clear you're not Fremen. And he's like,
yeah.
yeah, I am, and they're like, not by blood, you know. And so in his case, well, one that he came from another Earth, and that there were prophecies about him that he was fulfilling. He came to their, you know, when he put the still suit on, they said, oh, you put it on the right way. How did you know to do that? You
Spelt
will
right.
learn your ways as if born to them. It seems similar in some ways to this. That
Yeah.
you know, regularly fulfilling those prophecies over and over again. And so, yeah, that would be one. And I'm not quite sure how this one ties in, but kind of having dual heritage Well, actually, I think I do know how this fits in. So Jesus was of the line of David, right? And so he was of the line and lineage of King David. And so
Yes.
by his birth, he had a right to the throne. He didn't take that right to the throne because he knew that there was an eternal throne, because he had a different lineage. And so the lineage that Christ had was through both sides. Similarly, Paul has a dual lineage. And I'm sorry if I said that was about Paul. I apologize. I'm getting my words mixed up. But Paul has a dual lineage of being both a Bene Gesserit and a duke, right? And so he's got these kind of dual responsibilities of being expected to be the Kwisatz Haderach and the Lisan al Gaib. And so those are the Bene Gesserit and the Fremen versions of, well, Fremen would call him a messiah. The Bene Gesserit would say, like, oh, he's a very valuable tool for us to use. We'll talk about them later because they're a hot mess. But for anyone who's lost on all these terms and you're listening, sorry, it's Herbert just loved to give multiple names to everything.
Yeah.
So this is another very similarity.
Yeah,
right?
Just look it up on Google or something.
One great thing is a lot of the books have a dictionary in the back. Like this one actually has like a couple hundred pages of dictionary in the back. I'm like,
and you need it.
I wish more books had that.
Yes, you
do. And you probably do want to read it at some point. It's a pretty thorough list. I'll throw one out there, though. I think that, and